So my question is will Washington put Washington itself at risk, or New York, or Los Angeles, or Boston, or San Francisco, or Chicago in the defense of Taipei?
Hi friends, hello and welcome to another video. Today I will have the privilege of interviewing once again Professor Warwick Powell. He's an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology and a senior fellow at Taihe Institute in Beijing. Recently, Professor Warwick published an essay on his Substack called, and you're going to see the link in the description down below, An Asian Rupture. In this essay, he gives us a very comprehensive view of the Taiwan question, both historically and including some recent developments that we are going to discuss today. So, Professor Warwick, welcome to the show once again. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Great to be with you, Fernando.
Thank you. So let's jump into some of the questions. I'm going to go chronologically. Basically, you start your essay talking about how U.S. perceives China, U.S. policy, and the perception that they have of China. In your essay, you mentioned that America sees China through a Manichaean lens. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the specific language or the public decisions or public statements that exemplify this good versus evil framing, and how does this worldview shape U.S. policy decision, and what are the dangers of such a perspective?
Yeah, sure. It's a big question, and I'll try to hold the answer reasonably tight because questions like this, of course, have a historical pedigree. For those who are interested, there is another Substack article which I put together last year, I think called something like Dire Straits, which provides probably a little bit more deeper historical context in terms of the Taiwan question. But in terms of this Manichaean frame, which is this idea of the world being framed in dualist or good versus evil terms, we find that in recent times in the language of threat and the language of adversary. And that particular linguistic frame has become particularly pronounced in, say, the last 6 or 7 years. Think tanks have mobilized all sorts of ways of describing China as a threat to the United States. And of course, politicians on Capitol Hill have now arrived at what is a very solid bipartisan position, and that is that China represents the principal, if not the only real challenge to the United States. So much so that the political establishment, together with parts of the armed forces, really see China as, quote, the pacing threat, unquote. And America's mission, therefore, is to contain China and prohibit China from being what the United States sees as a challenge to American primacy in the world. This view, of course, has had quite a number of permutations historically. The period between, say, 1996 to 2016, so that's about 20 years, was a period often described as one of engagement. And that period, of course, delivered substantial economic interactions as well as social and cultural exchange between the two countries. But at the same time, from the United States point of view, that approach to engagement was rationalized on the basis that if China could be brought into the global system and be connected to the economic circuits of global neoliberalism, then in time, China's own polity and its character would change as well. So this was part of a broader modernization theoretical framework that implied that economic change through liberalization, market reforms, privatizations, etc., would ultimately lead to some form of institutional and political liberalization along the lines of parliamentary democracies. Now, none of that happened, of course. And prior to that period of engagement was another series of periods, particularly in the time after the revolution in 1949, when the United States really saw China as an ungodly other, and I mean by that the People's Republic of China and the fact that it was run by the Communist Party. So in the early 1950s, as McCarthyism emerged as a political doctrine in the United States, Senator Joseph McCarthy actually, in the early 1950s, described Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the Republic of China and the KMT, as our guy fighting our war. And he went on to describe what he meant by that. And he meant by that the idea of fighting a good Christian war against the godless communists. So for a long time throughout the last, say, 150 years or so, the United States has largely seen China as something of an historical aberration, an uncivilized other that needed to be saved, either spiritually or more lately politically, but ultimately also to be molded and transformed. And that's what I guess I mean when I start to describe, broadly speaking, the Manichaean frames that the American political establishment has when it comes to China.
Yeah, over the last few years, we've heard that rhetoric of just calling China the enemy, trying to make an enemy out of just your best trading partner. Um, in your article, in your essay, you also suggest that America is projecting strength while actually being in a weakened position. What sort of a specific indicators do you see as evidence of this weakness from the United States?
Look, weakness is a relative term, of course. You know, the United States is a big nation, a big population, and a big economy with substantial natural and technological and human resources. So when I talk about the United States being in a weakened position, I mean that in a relative sense. And it's relative because other countries in the world, and in this particular case, China, has become stronger in and of its own right. And that, of course, shifts the balance of power. So the United States, I think, is weaker in three main domains. Firstly, economically, the United States actually is no longer as important to the global economy as it once was. In the years immediately after the Second World War, the United States was really the only industrial economy left standing and contributed somewhere in the order of 50 odd percent of global GDP. It was central to the reindustrialization of the West, as well as Japan, through various funding schemes, and ultimately became the dominant player in the global economic landscape. That, of course, leveraged its emergent dominance in the years after the First World War as the British Empire began to recede. So economically, the United States was incredibly dominant in probably the 40 years or so, maybe even 50 years after the end of the Second World War. However, China's rise has reshaped the global landscape, and it's done that firstly by changing the nature of trading relationships. So on the question of trade, the United States used to be a much larger proportion of global imports than it is today. These days, it's about 14% or thereabouts. In other words, its market makes up about 14% of global sales. So in that sense, it's nowhere near as significant as it once was. In the 1970s and 1980s, the United States, and indeed even into the 1990s, the United States was the principal trading partner of most countries in the world. But by 2010 to 2015, that position had been overtaken by China. So economically, particularly from a trade point of view, the US market is no longer as significant as it once was. In terms of technology, of course, the United States has been the global leader in a number of dimensions. One is in terms of information technology, industrial technology, scientific research and development, and ultimately in the applications all of this has in the military domain. But in all of these areas, once again, there are counterbalances to United States primacy. In terms of technology, we now see China, but not only China, countries like Russia, draw on their depths of engineering capability and expansive educational systems to build industrial economies that are a rival to the United States' traditional position. That means that the United States economic structure no longer has the industrial dominance that it once did. In terms of information technology, that's a slightly different story. The US IT system and its telecommunications related industries, of course, have been essentially the only game in town until arguably the last 5 or 6 years. The IT world has been dominated by American big tech companies that have delivered hardware, software, and also the standard setting capabilities to enable the US to ultimately dictate the terms in which the rest of the world engages in the digital arena. And it's been able to use that to substantial advantage. A recent book by American scholars has described this as the underground empire. And what they mean by that is that the United States has been able to utilize its dominance in the information technology arena to interdict the transactions and communications undertaken by companies and other entities from other countries, to a point where United States security agencies ultimately persuaded SWIFT, which operates a data center in Virginia in North America, to release data on transactions that Iraq was involved in the early 2000s, and eventually relent to American pressure to sanction those transactions. So the United States has dominated that space. That's changing. The most obvious example of that is the refusal of Huawei to go away, and in fact, the response of the Chinese technology ecosystem to the raft of export controls and sanctions imposed by the United States speaks to the vitality of alternative technology capabilities in the world. And to cap all of that off, I guess we can only take a look at DeepSeek, which not only matched the capabilities of American large language models in the AI space, but has actually demonstrated an ability to deliver comparable performance outcomes using lower quality equipment and less energy. In other words, they are able to do the same with more. And on top of that, DeepSeek has released its foundational model as an open source resource for the rest of the world. So technologically, that's all changing as well. And of course, the last dimension, Fernando, is militarily. The United States has been the dominant power across the globe for many decades, notwithstanding the mutually assured destruction capabilities of the handful of nuclear powers that exist. That's also changing, and it's changing in part because of the reality of the conflict in Ukraine, the reality of the genocide in Gaza, the interventions of the Houthis in the Red Sea, and ultimately the withdrawal of the American Navy from that part of the world, and of course the progressive, if not particularly pronounced, retraction of American military resources at the front line in East Asia, as the US seeks to push its regional allies to take more responsibility and to occupy the front line. So on all of those dimensions, the United States today is no longer the single unquestioned system primate, but is perhaps best described as one amongst equals.
Yeah, it's a redefinition of weakness when you put it relative to who's becoming stronger. We just had the Shangri-La dialogue, and I wanted to start targeting the whole question about Taiwan and the U.S. presence in Taiwan. We all know that the U.S. has been actively salami slicing, the one China policy. Now, I would like to ask you this specific question. Which action do you think has contributed the most to this salami slicing? And what are the potential consequences for regional stability if this salami slicing continues?
Look, I'll be very, very short on this because there's lots of little things that go towards this issue of salami
Mm.
slicing. In short, the United States has in recent times actively encouraged the campaign to undermine the resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly back in the 1970s, insofar as the status of Taiwan is concerned, and more importantly, the status of the People's Republic of China as the only and sole legitimate government of all of China. That's one dimension. The other dimensions, of course, is the ongoing provision of military support to the forces on Taiwan, and more recently the expose that the United States actually has military personnel stationed permanently on Taiwan, delivering training and related support services to the Republic of China militia. These activities all go towards recanting America's previous diplomatic agreements, and ultimately, in a very practical sense, demonstrates a backtracking from the One China policy. There are other little instances too. For instance, the State Department removing references on its website to the policy position that the United States does not support Taiwanese independence. That removal took place in January, and unsurprisingly, Beijing expressed its displeasure at that. And from time to time, we have American politicians making a pilgrimage of sorts to Taiwan to indicate their political support for the regime that is headquartered in Taipei. So across a number of dimensions, the United States has, in very practical terms, sought to conditionalize and in many ways weaken its genuine commitment to this idea of there being only one China and that Taiwan is a part of China.
There's a question that I often get asked because this salami slicing, we could go on and on and on about all the different things that have taken place, from Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan and calling Taiwan a country from the pulpit, to Macron just trying to sell us the idea that Taiwan is a different nation, etc., etc. My question, and the one that I see a lot in my comments, is why is it that Beijing hasn't acted before? Why is it that Beijing lets it go this far?
I think that the answer lies in two fundamental reasons. One is one of relative strength, and not wanting
Mm.
to pick a fight when there were doubts about whether or not they would prevail in any combat situation. That's one, and that's just brute reality kind of calculus. But the other one is there has always been in Beijing a sense of hope and possibility that the unfinished civil war could ultimately be reconciled and resolved without any further shots being fired. And whilst there has been a modicum of optimism about that being a possibility, the powers that be have been happy to be restrained and not to pursue any other course of action. I think they're the fundamental reasons as to why, and they were in many regards happy to let time unfold, and for the progressive integration to happen just through things like expanded travel, reconnections of family members, increased trade, tourism, education, and those sorts of things ultimately would build an integration that was, for all intents and purposes, bar the question of foreign policy and defence policy, was in effect in place. That's basically where I think the position has been in recent historical times.
That's a great answer for the people in my comments. Now let's move on to the other section, big section in your essay, which is the opportunity for rupture. In
Yeah.
in your essay, you suggest that the current period of perceived U.S. weakness or relative weakness, as you explained, in fact presents an opportunity for rupture in Asia's security architecture. I would like to ask you to please elaborate a little bit more on what specific aspects of this U.S. relative weakness maybe economic, political, or military, do you think is more significant in creating this opening for a new security architecture in the region?
Yeah, look, I think that there's sort of two parts. One is a slightly bigger picture part, which really goes to the progressive, if as I said, a relatively unannounced retrenchment from the front lines. But nonetheless, there is an element in the immediate present where American frontline visibility and activity, I think, creates potentially an important catalyst, and that is that the United States continues to sell arms to the Republic of China forces on Taipei, and the United States has military presence on the island, notwithstanding the fact that some 35 years ago, the United States made commitments that it wouldn't do that. So those 2 points alone really point to the United States being an active agent provocateur in Taiwan and in the region at large, whereby it seeks, through its specific presence and its encouragement of the Republic of China forces, to possibly contemplate independence, to destabilize the relations across the straits, and ultimately through that to destabilize the relations of countries around Asia. That in and of itself is an act of destabilization of a nation's territorial sovereignty. Let's not forget that Taiwan is recognized by the overwhelming majority, bar a couple of handfuls of very, very small countries in the world, as being an intrinsic part of a single China, and that single China is represented by the government of the People's Republic of China, which is headquartered in Beijing. Because of that reality, any third-party interventions and activities on the island of Taiwan or other smaller islands that are part of the Taiwan area, such as Kinmen Island, are actually an external or third-party interference in the territorial sovereignty of a sovereign nation. That alone is grounds for China to calculate that they need to act in the name of preserving national sovereignty and, through that, preserving regional stability. And that is a potential catalyst for a series of events that I then go on to describe in that article. Now, in saying all of that, Fernando, I should say that talk of this scenario isn't a prediction of mine, nor is it an advocacy position. I'm not advocating that anybody should or shouldn't do this, but I aim to really think through what the sequence of events may look like in the event that this destabilization of national sovereignty did trigger a response of sorts from Beijing, because then we can truly understand what is at stake in the question of the unresolved civil war in China.
That is a very important statement to make, that this is not advocating for this, but this is in the event of this happening. This is what China and the People's Republic of China could do. I like the approach or the deep and lengthy explanation that you give of the diplomatic path that China could follow. I like the idea of the actions that China could take without a shot being fired. Now, could you talk us a little bit through this key diplomatic, economic, or informational levers that China could utilize to achieve this?
Yeah, sure. Look, the first thing I guess to bear in mind is that much of the talk coming out of Washington and others is this idea that China is preparing to invade the island. Now, the image that you get, of course, when that kind of language is used to describe a possible future is aeroplanes landing, paratroopers coming down from the sky, amphibious vehicles coming up on beaches, and those sorts of things, right? So that's the kind of imagery that is connoted when people talk about this idea that the People's Liberation Army from mainland China would, quote, invade, unquote, Taiwan. That's not necessarily what would happen. And in fact, what I suggest, thinking through one of these scenarios in that paper, is that an invasion in these terms is actually not something necessary at all to achieve ultimately the outcome of the completion or the finalization of the civil war by a political resolution to the Taiwan Straits question. And should Beijing have the view that the United States' ongoing presence on the island and selling arms to the island represents an unacceptably high risk to national territorial integrity, then it is conceivable that Beijing would rapidly surround the island and create a defensive cordon. I say a defensive cordon because from Beijing's point of view, given that Taiwan Island is part of China's overall national territory, such a cordon is there to ensure that external forces cannot come to further destabilize the island and destabilize the region. So a cordon is established with no-fly zones and also a maritime interdiction zone, whereby civilian traffic would be allowed, subject to inspections and permissions, but obviously any attempt to approach the island by way of military aircraft or military vessels would be treated in a defensive manner. So that's essentially, I think, the kind of response that's possible. But before that response necessarily takes place, it's likely, or more to the point, the way that these events may well unfold is that China would, in the first instance, make very strong formal representations to the United States through all of the usual diplomatic channels and submit what is known as a démarche, which is a very strong protest about the actions of Washington, namely the presence of troops and the provision of military equipment, missiles and the like, and calling on Washington to withdraw its troops and to desist from providing the military equipment, the missiles, etc., to Taiwan, and and possibly even to disable the technologies that have been provided to date. Needless to say, Washington will ignore that.
Yes.
In parallel, the issue could well be escalated to the United Nations Security Council, where notice is given for a special session dealing with a resolution on exactly those matters. And there would be, of course, a debate. It's likely that that Russia and China would vote in favor of the resolution, which is calling on America to cease and desist, to back off, withdraw, etc., etc. The British and the French, they're likely to abstain, I would think. But even if they didn't and they voted in a totally unlikely scenario that they voted with China on this, the United States would ultimately exercise its veto rights and once again, in a sense, ignore China's protests. And that's when I think China would have the very clear view that the United States has absolutely no intentions whatsoever of doing anything other than continue to destabilize the situation across the Straits and to support the separatist activities. In other words, to continue to niggle away at Chinese territorial sovereignty. And so, in the name of defending its territorial sovereignty, and protecting the island from any further incursions from outside forces, the defensive cordon would be established. And as we've seen in the last couple of years, such a defensive cordon can be established really within 6 to
Effective.
12 hours, incredibly fast.
Hmm.
So fast that, in fact, it is inconceivable and improbable that any other third-party nation in the region would be able to effectively respond. So a cordon would be established.
Mm. In your essay, you also talk about suggesting a very well-tailored one country, two system formula for the island of Taiwan. What specific provisions regarding internal autonomy or legal systems or even PLA presence on the island do you envision as being part of this tailored formula? How would they operate?
Look, before I dive into that, I guess one of the things to think about is how that defensive cordon would play out, because I think that this will set the stage for the nature of the one country, two systems proposal to be put on the table. The Obviously, there are divergent views amongst the political forces and the population at large on the island insofar as this question of reunification and status quo or separation and independence is concerned. Overwhelmingly, public opinion polls do point to support for the status quo, with limited support for reunification formally and limited support for the declaration of independence, largely, I think, because the people who live on the island know that any moves towards independence comes with incredible risks. And there is absolutely nothing to be gained by undertaking such a provocative action. So status quo it is. Now, we have also, of course, political forces who have different views about the relationship with the mainland, and assuming that a pro-independence regime is in place in Taipei, the defensive cordon that's put around the island will create a crisis on the island without a doubt. The crisis will, of course, have both economic implications and, of course, also domestic political implications. Domestically, pressure is likely to build for some kind of a response. Now, the response, of course, can range from the ROC or the Republic of China military firing the first shots at the defensive cordon that's been established. Now, of course, if they did that and they were the principal instigator of another round of warring, then well, I guess we'd have to wait and see how Beijing would respond to that. But of course, Beijing is in a position to respond with incredible force and overwhelming force, I would suggest. So it's unlikely that the forces on Taiwan will go down that path. The pressure will come on an administration to find a political settlement. And if the pro-independence forces, assuming that they control the government there, refuse to really do anything sensible and constructive, I wouldn't be surprised if the military intervened. Now, the military itself, of course, will have divergent views, but there will be parts of the military, which, of course, has a history of being incredibly pragmatic and not ideological, to have a very strong survival instinct kick in, and they will move in and declare martial law. And they will do that because they want to stabilize the domestic instabilities that have been caused and to open the channels by which a discussion can be entertained with Beijing. And that, of course, is all taking place against the backdrop of Western forces being reluctant to act. The United States is unlikely to actually act. It's actually not in their character to be the first mover. It's entirely in America's character to put someone else in harm's way, like they have done in Europe. And if there is a lesson to be learned out of the situation in Ukraine, it is that the United States has an overwhelming instinct to prepare and groom others to fight America's wars. And there is every likelihood that it will seek to cajole, encourage, or bully Japan, the Philippines, Republic of Korea, and Australia, indeed, to take on this cordon. The United States won't do it. Now, will any of those other countries move? Well, I suspect not without guarantees of the American forces sitting as the backstop. And I doubt that the Americans will do that. It is a crisis for America, of course, because ultimately its big talking will be put immediately to the test. Now, why won't they act, right? Given that there is so much at stake reputationally. And I think the main reason they won't act is that, and this is the contextual stuff, is that if they acted, the first thing that they would be doing is declaring war on another major nuclear power. That's foolhardy. And as belligerent as many in Washington often are, I suspect that there is nonetheless a very strong reluctance to go down the path of declaring war on another nuclear power. The second reason is that a declaration of war on China and an attack on China and on Chinese territory, meaning the island of Taiwan, if not the mainland, could also trigger the DPRK to respond under a 1961 treaty that the DPRK and the People's Republic of China have, and which is still in force, and that is a mutual defence treaty. So the DPRK, which is also a nuclear power, would enter into the fray. Should the DPRK enter into the fray, it is also likely then to bring the Russians in. And the Russians will be brought in not as an automatic legal obligation, but certainly as part of its recently inked agreement with the DPRK, which includes, of course, elements of mutual defence as well. So suddenly, a move on the People's Republic of China and any territories considered to be Chinese would actually trigger the involvement of two other nuclear powers. So now we're talking about 4 nuclear powers in a standoff. So my question is will Washington put Washington itself at risk, or New York, or Los Angeles, or Boston, or San Francisco, or Chicago, in the defense of Taipei? And I suspect the answer is no.
Yes.
And because of that, I doubt that any of the other regional nations would contemplate coming to the aid of the regime on Taipei.
I've always said that time is on China's side. China has all the time and all the patience in the world to wait until, well, the strength of the United States continues to diminish, and the dependency of Taiwan to the mainland via trade and others will become a necessity, will become something that they will do out of their own willingness, seeing that the rest of the world is following the US and the US is not doing all that well. Warwick, I want to thank you very much for your time. These are all the questions that I wanted to ask you related to your essay. And I want to invite everyone to go to the link in the description where the essay will be in a link. Really, really informative document. And again, thank you so much for expanding on some of the topics and some of the questions that I had related to the essay today. Warwick, do you have any last comments? I would like to invite you on a future show, but do you have anything that you would like to tell us related to this topic before we go?
Look, I think what's important. Well, firstly, thank you for having me on the show. I hope your viewers get something from this discussion. The aim really is to think through some of the issues at stake and to also come to some realizations around some critical realities. And these critical realities are going to define how the issue will ultimately settle. If I was to say one more thing, it is that should these sorts of events play out, then what will happen is that the actors in the region will need to find a way to build new institutions. And it would be inconceivable for me to think that whilst all of what I just described was playing out, that the administrations in Tokyo and in Seoul were not quickly on the phones to the folk in Beijing and elsewhere to open dialogue about what a future looks like. Because let's not forget that the diplomatic strategy that I described to you would necessarily involve the representatives of these various countries being briefed on all the issues and be kept informed throughout this process as to what's happening. Because it's obviously of material interest to all the countries of Asia, ASEAN, Japan, Republic of Korea, the DPRK, and indeed Russia. And because of that, it's likely that the countries will move post haste to opening the dialogue for some kind of a conference, if you will, to reimagine a regional security architecture in which the United States is no longer a primary player. And that, I think, is something that, frankly speaking, is already exercising the minds of strategic thinkers in the governments of various countries across the region.
Most certainly. Okay, Warwick, I'm very fortunate to be in a group where you share so much information, and I thank you for sharing this particular essay with me so that I could make this video and share it with the rest of the people. But you've also talked a lot about default from the US, but that's for another topic, because this is something that a lot of people don't understand, and I would really like you to help them understand why that is critical to understand. That is not the main issue. But then again, it's for another video. Warwick, thank you so much. And to everyone watching, make sure to hit the link in the description to go see the essay and let us know in the comments what you think about these different positions that we explored today with Professor Warwick. And well, until we see you again, take it easy and bye for now.
Bye-bye. Thank you.